The crisis began on a cold Monday morning in January when Thomas discovered Elena teaching Margaret to write her name in the margins of an old newspaper. He had returned earlier than expected from his monthly trip to the wholesale market, and he found them bent over the counter together, completely absorbed in their lesson. "What exactly is going on here?" Thomas demanded, his voice sharp with anger. Elena felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Margaret is helping me organize the inventory sheets. I thought it would be useful if she could write down the numbers clearly." Thomas studied the newspaper with Elena's patient corrections written in pencil and Margaret's careful attempts to form letters. His expression grew darker with each passing second. "Elena, we need to talk." Privately, he turned to Margaret, who had gone pale with fear. "You need to go home now, girl. And don't come back unless you're here to buy something." Elena watched helplessly as Margaret gathered her few belongings and headed for the door. The little girl's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she held her head high as she walked past Thomas. Just before leaving, she turned back to Elena with a look that clearly said, "This is not your fault." Once Margaret was gone, Thomas unleashed weeks of pent-up frustration and suspicion. He accused Elena of wasting time, giving away inventory, and encouraging freeloaders. He reminded her that their financial situation was precarious and that they could not afford to run a charity. Most hurtfully, he suggested that Elena was being manipulated by a clever child who had learned to play on her emotions. "I see what's happening here," Thomas said coldly. "You're lonely, so you've convinced yourself that this girl actually cares about you. But children only care about what they can get from adults. You're giving away our food and our time to someone who will disappear the moment she finds a better opportunity." Elena tried to defend Margaret and explain the value of their friendship, but Thomas cut her off. "This ends now. That child is not welcome in this store unless she's making a purchase. And you need to remember why you're here, to help build this business, not to play school teacher with neighborhood children." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with Thomas making increasingly cruel comments about Elena's naivety and Margaret's motivations. By the end, Elena felt crushed and confused. Thomas had a way of twisting words and situations until she began to doubt her own perceptions and judgments. That night, Elena sat by her window looking down at the street and wondering if Thomas was right. Had she been foolish to believe that Margaret genuinely cared about her? Was their friendship real, or was she simply a convenient source of food and attention for a clever child? 3 days passed without Margaret appearing at the store. Elena told herself that this was for the best. Thomas was right that they needed to focus on business, and she had been spending too much time on reading lessons when she should have been working. But despite her attempts to rationalize the situation, she felt hollow and purposeless. The days dragged by without the bright spot of Margaret's afternoon visits. On Thursday evening, Elena was sweeping the front steps when she heard a small voice calling her name. She looked up to see Margaret standing at the corner, just far enough away to avoid Thomas's notice if he happened to look out the window. "Elena, I need to talk to you," Margaret called softly. Elena glanced nervously at the store, then walked to the edge of the sidewalk where she could speak with Margaret without being overheard. "I'm sorry I got you in trouble," Margaret said, her words coming out in a rush. "I didn't mean to make your husband angry. If you want me to stop coming, I understand." Looking at Margaret's earnest face, Elena felt ashamed of her doubts. This child was not manipulative or calculating. She was genuinely concerned about Elena's welfare and willing to sacrifice their friendship to protect her from Thomas's anger. "Oh, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong," Elena said, crouching down to Margaret's level. "My husband is worried about money, and sometimes when people are worried they say things they don't really mean." Margaret nodded gravely. "Papa does that too when he's scared about work." Elena realized that Margaret understood adult emotions and motivations far better than Thomas gave her credit for. This 7-year-old had learned to read the moods and fears of the adults around her as a matter of survival. "Margaret, I want you to know that being your friend has made me happier than I've been in a very long time," Elena said. "But I think we need to be more careful about when and how we see each other." Margaret's face lit up with hope. "You still want to be friends?" "Of course I do. But we might have to meet in different places, and We'll need to make sure we don't cause any more problems for either of our families." They agreed that Margaret would continue her reading practice at home using the techniques Elena had taught her, and that they would find ways to meet occasionally without drawing Thomas's attention. It was not the ideal solution, but it was better than losing their friendship entirely. The next few weeks were challenging for both of them. Elena felt increasingly isolated and lonely without Margaret's daily visits. Thomas seemed satisfied that the distraction had been eliminated, but Elena found herself growing resentful of his control over her relationships. She began to question whether this was the life she really wanted, always asking permission, always putting business before human connection. Margaret, meanwhile, was struggling with her own family crisis. Her father's hours at the mill had been cut even further, and her mother was considering taking a job at a factory that would require her to work nights. This would leave Margaret responsible for caring for baby Patrick during the evenings, a responsibility that felt overwhelming for a 7-year-old. One particularly difficult afternoon, Margaret made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. Instead of going home after school, she walked to the grocery store and waited across the street until she saw Thomas leave for his daily banking trip. Then, she quickly crossed the street and slipped into the store. "Elena, I need help," she said without preamble. "Something bad is happening at home." Elena immediately dropped what she was doing and gave Margaret her full attention. Through tears and halting words, Margaret explained that her parents had been fighting more frequently and more intensely. Her father was talking about leaving Chicago to look for work in other cities, possibly Detroit or Cleveland. Her mother was exhausted from working and caring for baby Patrick, who had been sick frequently throughout the winter. "And the worst part," Margaret whispered, "is that they're talking about sending me to live with my aunt in Boston until they can get back on their feet. Aunt Mary doesn't like children, and I don't want to leave Chicago. I don't want to leave you." Elena felt her heart break for this child who was being forced to confront the possibility of losing everything familiar and safe in her world. She also realized that Margaret had come to her because she trusted Elena to help find a solution, even when the adults in her own family seemed overwhelmed by their problems. "Sweetheart, I wish I could wave a magic wand and fix everything for your family," Elena said gently. "But sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard decisions when money is scarce and there aren't enough jobs." Margaret nodded, but Elena could see that she was fighting to hold back tears. "I know. I just thought, maybe you would know what to do. You always know how to make stories have happy endings." Elena realized that Margaret was not asking for a magical solution. She was asking for hope, for someone to help her believe that this crisis would not last forever. It was the same thing Elena had been searching for since arriving in Chicago. "Let me think about this," Elena said. "Maybe there are some options your parents haven't considered yet. Can you come back tomorrow after school? I might have some ideas by then." Margaret nodded and prepared to leave, but before she reached the door, she turned back to Elena. "Elena, even if I have to go to Boston, I want you to know that you're the best friend I've ever had. You taught me that I'm smart and that stories can help when everything feels scary. I'll never forget that." After Margaret left, Elena sat in the quiet store and thought about everything that had led to this moment. She thought about her own journey from Poland, the desperate hope that had brought her to Chicago, and the slow realization that hope alone was not enough to build a satisfying life. She thought about Thomas's limited vision of what their marriage and business could become. Most importantly, she thought about Margaret, bright, brave, loving Margaret, who was about to be separated from everything familiar because the adults around her were focused on survival rather than solutions. That night, Elena made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She was going to help Margaret's family, even if it meant defying Thomas and risking her own security. She had spent months learning to be small and invisible, to ask for nothing and expect less. But Margaret's crisis had reminded her that she had skills, intelligence, and courage that she had been hiding even from herself. Elena had been working in the grocery store long enough to understand the neighborhood's economy and needs. She knew which families were struggling, which businesses were thriving, and where opportunities might exist for someone willing to work hard and think creatively. She also knew that her language skills and Her experience helping Thomas with the business had given her knowledge that could be valuable to other families in similar situations. Over the next 2 days, Elena quietly made inquiries around the neighborhood. She spoke with Mrs. O'Brien, who ran a boarding house and was always looking for reliable help. She talked to Mr. Kowalski, who owned a small tailor shop and had mentioned needing someone to help with his books. She even approached Father Murphy at the local Catholic church, who often knew about job opportunities and family assistance programs. By Thursday afternoon, Elena had identified several possibilities that might help the Sullivan family. Mrs. O'Brien was willing to hire Margaret's mother for part-time work that could be done from home, mending linens and helping with meal preparation for her boarders. Mr. Kowalski needed someone to organize his customer files and handle correspondence, work that could be done during school hours. Father Murphy knew of a Catholic charity that provided temporary assistance for families with young children. But Elena also realized that presenting these options to the Sullivan family would require more than just passing along information. Someone would need to help them navigate the application processes, make the necessary introductions, and provide ongoing support to ensure the arrangements worked out successfully. It would require time, energy, and a level of involvement that Thomas would certainly never approve. Elena was standing at another crossroads, but this time she knew exactly which direction she wanted to go. She was tired of being a passive observer in her own life. She was tired of letting fear and financial insecurity prevent her from acting on her values and using her abilities to help others. Most importantly, she was tired of pretending that survival without purpose was sufficient. When Margaret arrived at the store after school on Thursday, Elena had not just ideas to share, she had a plan. But implementing that plan would require courage from both of them. And it would mean accepting that their friendship was about to evolve into something much more complex and potentially dangerous. Margaret returned to the grocery store the next afternoon, just as Elena had hoped she would. This time, she brought something with her, a small wooden doll that had seen better days. The doll's face was painted in simple features, and her dress was made from scraps of fabric that Margaret's mother had sewn together during rare moments of free time. "This is Rosie," Margaret explained to Elena, holding up the doll. "She likes stories too." Elena smiled and welcomed both Margaret and Rosie into the store. Thomas had gone to meet with a supplier and would not return for at least an hour. It felt like a gift, this time alone with the little girl who had somehow managed to break through the wall Elena had built around her heart. What kind of story would Rosie like to hear? Elena asked, settling into the chair behind the counter while Margaret sat cross-legged on the floor. Margaret considered this seriously. She's been sad lately because she thinks nobody wants to play with her. Maybe a story about making friends. Elena nodded and began to tell a tale about a little doll who lived in a toy shop where all the other toys were afraid to talk to her because she looked different. But one day, a kind teddy bear realized that being different made her special, not strange, and soon all the toys in the shop were asking her to teach them her unique way of seeing the world. As Elena spoke, she watched Margaret's face transform. The careful, guarded expression melted away, replaced by wonder and delight. Margaret asked questions about the characters, suggested plot twists, and even supplied different voices for the various toys in the story. It was clear that the child had a natural storytelling ability of her own. When Thomas returned, Elena quickly suggested that Margaret help her sweep the front steps in exchange for an apple. Thomas approved of this arrangement. Free labor in exchange for damaged fruit was good business sense. He had no idea that the real transaction happening was much more valuable than a few minutes of sweeping. This pattern continued for several days. Margaret would appear at the store each afternoon, help with small tasks that Thomas approved of, and then listen to Elena's stories while Thomas was busy with other duties. Elena discovered that Margaret had an exceptional memory for details and could retell the stories almost perfectly to Rosie when they got home. On the 5th day of their friendship, Margaret arrived at the store with tears in her eyes. Elena immediately noticed the change and gently asked what was wrong. "Mama and Papa had a big fight last night," Margaret whispered. "Papa said there's not enough money for food this week, and Mama said maybe she should go work at the factory instead of taking in washing. But then, who would take care of baby Patrick when he's sick?" Elena's heart ached for this child who was carrying worries far too heavy for her 7-year-old shoulders. She knew exactly what it felt like to worry about having enough food, to wonder if the people who were supposed to take care of you would be able to keep their promises. Would it help if I told you an extra long story today? Elena offered. About a family of rabbits who learned that the most important treasures are not the ones you can put in your pocket. Margaret nodded gratefully, and Elena launched into an elaborate tale that lasted nearly 40 minutes. She spoke about Papa Rabbit who worked so hard to find carrots for his family that he forgot to enjoy the sunshine, and Mama Rabbit who worried so much about tomorrow that she missed the beautiful flowers blooming today. The baby rabbits in the story learned that when families stick together and help each other, they can get through even the coldest winters. As Elena told the story, she realized she was not just entertaining Margaret. She was also working through her own feelings about family, security, and what really mattered in life. The stories were becoming a way for both of them to process the difficult realities they faced each day. When the story ended, Margaret hugged her doll tightly and looked up at Elena with serious brown eyes. Elena, are you sad too sometimes? The directness of the question caught Elena off guard. She had been so focused on comforting Margaret that she had not realized how much her own emotions were showing through the stories. Yes, sweetheart, I am sad sometimes, Elena admitted. But do you know what helps me feel better? Margaret shook her head. Talking to you and telling stories makes me feel better. Even when everything else is hard, I know that every afternoon I get to see my friend Margaret, and that makes the sad feelings smaller. Margaret beamed at being called Elena's friend. It was perhaps the first time in her young life that an adult had acknowledged her as someone worthy of friendship rather than just someone who needed to be fed, clothed, and kept out of trouble. Their bond deepened over the following weeks. Elena began to time her chores around Margaret's visits, making sure she always had a story ready and a small snack to share. She started saving the best bruised apples for Margaret and would sometimes slip an extra piece of bread into the child's pocket when Thomas was not looking. Margaret, in return, became Elena's most devoted helper. She learned where everything belonged in the store and would quietly organize shelves while Elena worked. She swept the front steps without being asked and even helped Elena translate for Polish customers who struggled with English. Her presence made Elena's long, lonely days feel purposeful and bright. Thomas remained oblivious to the true nature of their friendship. He saw only that Elena had found free labor in the form of a well-behaved child, and that Margaret's help allowed Elena to complete her tasks more efficiently. What he did not see was the way Elena's entire demeanor changed when Margaret arrived, or how the little girl had begun to think of the grocery store as a safe haven in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. One particularly cold afternoon in November, Margaret arrived at the store shivering despite her coat. Elena noticed that the coat was thin and had several holes that had been carefully patched. Margaret's cheeks were red from the wind, and her hands were almost blue from the cold. "Goodness, sweetheart, you're freezing," Elena said, immediately wrapping her own shawl around Margaret's shoulders. "Come stand by the heating vent while I make you some warm tea." Elena had been saving a small packet of tea for special occasions. It was one of the few luxuries she allowed herself. But, seeing Margaret's chattering teeth, she decided that a friend in need was the most special occasion of all. As Margaret warmed up with the tea and Elena's shawl, she began to tell Elena about her day. Her teacher at school had been cross because Margaret did not have proper paper for her writing lessons. Her mother had been up all night with baby Patrick, who was teething and crying. Her father had come home from work with news that the mill was cutting hours again, which meant even less money for the family. Elena listened to each worry with the serious attention it deserved. Then, she had an idea that surprised even herself. "Margaret, how would you like to learn to read?" The little girl's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really? You would teach me?" Elena nodded, her heart racing with the boldness of her offer. "I have a book upstairs with beautiful pictures, and we could start with simple words. If you're going to be my official helper, you should know how to read the labels on the shelves." This was not entirely true. Thomas had never made Margaret an official helper, and he certainly would not approve of Elena spending time teaching instead of working. But Elena was tired of asking Thomas's permission for everything, especially when it came to showing kindness to a child who desperately needed it. They began that very afternoon with Elena's book of folk tales. Elena taught Margaret to recognize simple words like the, and princess. Margaret was a quick learner, eager to absorb every lesson Elena offered. Within a week, she could sound out basic sentences, and within 2 weeks, she was reading simple passages aloud to Rosie the doll. Thomas eventually noticed that Margaret seemed to be spending more time in the store, but Elena had prepared for this. She explained that Margaret was helping her create a better organization system for the inventory, which would save time and prevent mistakes. This was actually true. Margaret had suggested several improvements to the way they arranged the shelves, and her suggestions had made Elena's work considerably easier. What Thomas did not know was that Elena had also begun teaching Margaret basic arithmetic during their reading lessons. Margaret learned to count by helping Elena balance the store's books, and she practiced addition and subtraction by calculating change for imaginary customers. Elena discovered that Margaret had a natural talent for numbers and could solve problems that would have challenged children much older than 7. As winter deepened, their friendship became a source of warmth and light for both of them. Elena looked forward to Margaret's visits with an intensity that surprised her. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, she had something to wake up for besides duty and survival. Margaret, meanwhile, began to flourish under Elena's attention and encouragement. Her confidence grew, her smile came more easily, and she started to believe that she was smart and capable and worthy of love. The reading lessons became the foundation for something much larger. Elena taught Margaret about the countries where her folk tales originated, showing her how to find Poland and Ireland and Germany on the old atlas she had brought from home. They talked about different cultures and traditions, about why people told stories, and about how books could take you anywhere in the world without ever leaving your chair. Margaret soaked up these lessons like a flower absorbing rain after a drought. She asked thoughtful questions about everything Elena taught her, from the reasons people immigrated to America to the ways that stories could help people understand each other better. Elena began to realize that she was not just teaching Margaret to read. She was helping to shape a curious, compassionate, intelligent young woman. One afternoon in early December, Margaret arrived at the store with exciting news. "Elena, I read a whole page in my school book today. Miss Patterson said I was the best reader in the class, and she asked me how I learned so fast." Elena's heart swelled with pride. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that my friend Elena is teaching me, and that she tells the best stories in the whole world. Miss Patterson said she would like to meet you someday." Elena felt a mixture of joy and terror at this suggestion. She was proud of Margaret's progress, but she was also aware that their friendship existed in a delicate balance. Thomas tolerated Margaret's presence as long as it seemed to benefit the store, but Elena was not sure how he would react if their relationship became more public or official. Still, Margaret's success gave Elena a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced before. She had always been told that her value lay in her ability to work hard and cause no trouble. But teaching Margaret had shown her that she had other gifts: patience, creativity, and the ability to help someone else discover their own potential. That night, Elena lay awake thinking about how much her life had changed since Margaret first approached the store. The hunger and loneliness were still there, but they no longer defined her entire existence. She had found purpose in helping Margaret learn and grow, and she had discovered that she was capable of love that asked for nothing in return except the joy of giving. Margaret, too, was changing. The careful, guarded child who had first stood outside the store was becoming more confident and outgoing. She made friends at school more easily now that she could read as well as anyone in her class. She helped her mother with household tasks, and even taught baby Patrick simple songs that Elena had shared with her. Neither Elena nor Margaret realized that they were approaching a crossroads that would test everything they had built together. Thomas was beginning to notice changes in Elena that he did not understand or approve of. She seemed less subservient, more confident, and disturbingly independent. He was also becoming aware that the neighborhood children seemed to know Elena's name and would sometimes wave to her when they passed the store. Change was coming, and it would force both Elena and Margaret to make choices about what their friendship was worth and how far they were willing to go to protect each other. The safe, predictable routine they had established was about to be shattered, and they would need to find new ways to be there for one another. But for now, they had their daily stories, their reading lessons, and the warm certainty that they had found in each other something precious and irreplaceable. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but today they had each other, and that was enough. Elena Kowalski pressed her face against the cold window of the train as it pulled into Chicago's Union Station. The year was 1923, and she carried everything she owned in a small cloth bag that had seen better days. At 22, she had already buried her parents, lost her family farm to debt, and made the hardest decision of her life. She had answered a mail-order bride advertisement that promised a new beginning in America. The letter from Thomas Morrison had been simple and direct. He needed a wife to help with his small grocery store and modest home. He promised 3 meals a day, a roof over her head, and the chance to build something together. What he had not mentioned in his neat handwriting was that his idea of 3 meals meant leftover scraps from the store, and his modest home was a cramped apartment above the shop that smelled of old cheese and broken dreams. Elena had discovered the truth within her first week in Chicago. Thomas was not cruel in the way that left bruises you could see, but his indifference was a cold that settled into her bones and refused to leave. He provided exactly what he had promised, nothing more, nothing less. She had a place to sleep, but not a home. She had food, but never enough to stop the constant ache in her stomach. She had a husband, but not a companion. The grocery store sat on the corner of Ashland and Division, in a neighborhood where Polish and Irish immigrants mixed with Italian families and the occasional German shopkeeper. Everyone was struggling to make their way in this new country, but most had family or friends to lean on. Elena had only Thomas, and Thomas treated her more like an employee than a wife. Her days began before dawn, sweeping the store, arranging the vegetables that were starting to turn, and counting the few coins in the register. Thomas had made it clear that every penny mattered, and waste of any kind would not be tolerated. When customers came in speaking Polish, Elena's eyes would light up for a moment as she heard the familiar sounds of her homeland. But Thomas discouraged her from lingering in conversation. Time was money, he reminded her, and they had very little of either. The apartment above the store consisted of 3 small rooms. The kitchen held a table for 2, though they rarely ate together. Thomas preferred to take his meals at the counter downstairs while reading the newspaper. The bedroom contained a narrow bed and a chest of drawers that Elena had never been invited to use. She kept her few belongings in her cloth bag, ready to leave at a moment's notice, though she had nowhere to go. The third room was supposed to be a sitting room, but Thomas used it to store extra inventory from the shop. Boxes of canned goods and bags of flour created narrow pathways between the walls. Elena sometimes sat on an overturned crate by the window in the evenings, watching the street below and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. It was on one of these evenings that she first noticed the little girl. 7-year-old Margaret Sullivan lived 3 blocks away in a tenement building that housed 6 Irish families. Her father worked long hours at the steel mill, and her mother took in washing to make ends meet. Like many children in the neighborhood, Margaret was often left to entertain herself while the adults worked to survive. But Margaret was different from the other children who played in the streets. While they gathered in groups, laughing and chasing each other, Margaret walked alone. She moved with the careful steps of a child who had learned not to draw attention to herself. Her clothes were clean but patched in multiple places, and she carried herself with a seriousness that seemed too heavy for her small shoulders. Elena first spoke to Margaret on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The little girl had been standing outside the grocery store for nearly an hour, not begging or asking for anything, just watching the people go in and out. Elena had noticed her through the window and felt a familiar ache in her chest. She recognized something in Margaret's posture, in the way she held herself apart from the world. It was the same isolation Elena felt every day. When Thomas went to the bank to make the daily deposit, Elena stepped outside and approached the child. Margaret had large brown eyes that seemed to take in everything but reveal nothing. Her hair was braided neatly, but several strands had escaped, and framed her face in the afternoon wind. "Are you waiting for someone?" Elena asked gently, crouching down to the girl's level. Margaret shook her head, but did not move away. There was something in her expression that reminded Elena of herself at that age. Watchful, careful, hoping for kindness, but not expecting it. "Would you like to come inside where it's warmer?" Elena offered. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. Elena could see the internal debate playing out in the child's eyes. Finally, Margaret nodded and followed Elena into the store. The grocery store was small but well-organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with basic necessities that working families could afford. Sacks of flour and sugar sat on the floor, and a glass case near the register held a few pieces of penny candy that local children would stare at longingly. Elena led Margaret to a chair behind the counter and offered her a small apple that was slightly bruised on one side. "What's your name?" Elena asked as Margaret carefully bit into the apple, making sure not to waste any of it. "Margaret Sullivan," the girl replied quietly. "My friends call me Maggie, but I don't have many friends." Elena felt her heart break a little at the matter-of-fact way Margaret said this. "I'm Elena. I help run this store with my husband." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes while Margaret ate the apple. Elena noticed that the child ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last meal. It was a behavior Elena recognized in herself. The way hunger teaches you to make small portions last as long as possible. "Do you like stories?" Elena asked suddenly, remembering the few books her mother had read to her before the hard times came. Margaret's eyes lit up for the first time since Elena had seen her. "I love stories, but I can't read yet. My mama says she'll teach me when she has time, but she's always working." Elena thought about the old book tucked away in her cloth bag upstairs. It was a collection of folk tales her mother had given her, written in Polish but with beautiful illustrations that told their own stories. She had not looked at it since arriving in Chicago, afraid that it would make her homesickness worse. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" Elena offered. Margaret nodded eagerly, and for the next 20 minutes, Elena told her about a brave princess who lived in a castle made of ice, and how she learned that the warmest place in any castle was not near the fire, but wherever kind people gathered together. She made up most of the details as she went along, but Margaret listened with the intense focus of someone who had been hungry for stories just as much as she had been hungry for food. When Thomas returned from the bank, he found Elena and Margaret laughing together over Elena's description of the ice princess trying to cook soup in a frozen kitchen. His expression immediately darkened, and Elena felt her stomach drop. "Elena, we've talked about this," Thomas said curtly. "The store is not a charity." Margaret immediately stood up, her small face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, mister. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Elena started to protest, but Thomas was already holding the door open. "Run along home now, girl. Your parents are probably looking for you." After Margaret left, Thomas lectured Elena about maintaining proper boundaries with customers. He reminded her that they could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone provide free food and entertainment to neighborhood children. Elena nodded and apologized, but inside she felt something shift. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, she had felt useful, needed, and genuinely happy. Telling that story to Margaret had reminded her of who she used to be before hunger and loneliness had worn her down to almost nothing. That night, Elena lay awake thinking about Margaret's eager face when she offered to tell a story. She thought about the careful way the little girl had eaten the apple, and the loneliness that seemed to surround her like an invisible coat. Elena had recognized something in Margaret because they were both hungry, not just for food, but for connection, for someone to see them and care about their stories. In the morning, Elena made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She would find ways to help Margaret, even if it meant going against Thomas's wishes. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being hungry, and tired of pretending that survival was the same thing as living. If she was going to be miserable in this new life, she might as well be miserable while doing something that mattered. Elena had no way of knowing that Margaret had gone home that night and told her exhausted mother about the nice lady at the grocery store who knew stories about ice princesses. She did not know that Margaret had asked her mother if there really were people in the world who wanted to tell children stories just to make them happy. And She certainly did not know that Margaret had already decided to visit the grocery store again the next day, hoping that Elena might have more stories to share. The threads of their friendship had been woven together in a single afternoon, but neither Elena nor Margaret realized yet how strong those threads would become. They were both reaching towards something they needed desperately, not just companionship, but the chance to matter in someone else's story. In a neighborhood full of people struggling to survive, they had found in each other the possibility of something more than mere survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring Margaret back to the grocery store, and Elena would be ready with another story. Neither of them knew that they were about to embark on a journey that would test their courage, challenge their limitations, and ultimately prove that love is not always romantic or dramatic. Sometimes love is as simple as a woman who has almost nothing deciding to share her stories with a child who needs them desperately. The dusty streets of 1920s Chicago, where hope came in letters and love was bought with promises, two strangers were about to discover that sometimes the most broken people find each other at exactly the right moment. One was a woman who had traveled thousands of miles for a husband who barely fed her scraps. The other was a 7-year-old girl whose own family had forgotten what kindness looked like. What happened when their worlds collided on a cold Tuesday afternoon would prove that the smallest acts of courage can rewrite the biggest stories. This is not just a tale of survival. It's the story of how a single question, "Please read me a story," became the bridge between two hearts that refused to give up on hope, even when hope seemed to have given up on them. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories don't begin with romance. Sometimes they begin with a hungry woman and a lonely child, both brave enough to believe that tomorrow could be different than today.